The August heat pressed down on Natchez, Mississippi like a hand over a drowning mouth. Even the cicadas seemed to scream their complaints into the thick air that hung between the live oaks, their Spanish moss swaying without any real breeze to move them. Everpine Plantation stretched across 300 acres of cotton fields, its white columns rising from the red earth-like bones from a grave that refused to stay closed. Evelyn Carrington stood at the second-floor window of the main house, her fingers pressed against the glass until they left small prints of condensation. She was 32 years old, though people often said she looked younger, something about the way she held herself, the careful arrangement of her dark hair, the posture that spoke of Charleston finishing schools and French tutors. Her dress was the color of mourning doves, high-necked despite the heat, and she hadn't moved from that window in nearly an hour. Below, in the fields that rolled toward the tree line, she could see them working. 47 souls, though the colonel's ledger called them property. 47 people whose names she had memorized in the 3 years since her marriage, though she was never supposed to know them. Never supposed to see them as anything but numbers in a book and labor in a field. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Mrs. Carrington, your tea is ready. The voice belonged to Sarah, who had served the house for 12 years. She was somewhere past 50, her hands marked by decades of work, her eyes holding secrets that would never be spoken aloud in the presence of white faces. Evelyn didn't turn. Leave it on the table, Sarah, and close the door when you leave. The soft click of the door was the only answer. Evelyn finally moved, her reflection ghosting across the glass as she stepped back into the shadows of the room. The furniture here was French, imported before the wedding. Her father's gift, a reminder that she had come from money older than the colonel's, from a Charleston family whose ships had made fortunes before Mississippi was even properly surveyed. She had been raised to be ornamental, to speak 3 languages, to play piano, to discuss literature and pour tea and smile at the right moments. She had been raised to marry well, which meant marrying well, which meant looking the other way when that wealth came from places and practices that Charleston society preferred not to examine too closely. But she had not been raised to be a fool. The first time she suspected, it was December. The colonel had come to dinner late, his shirt changed, but his boots still carrying red clay from somewhere other than the stables. He had kissed her cheek with lips that tasted like whiskey and guilt, and made conversation about cotton prices while avoiding her eyes. The second time, it was February. She had gone looking for him to discuss the spring garden plans and found his office empty, his coat still on the chair, his horse still in the stable. One of the house servants, a girl named Mercy, who couldn't have been more than 16, had disappeared from her duties for the same hour. Mercy returned with her apron torn. The colonel returned with scratches on his neck he blamed on thorns. Evelyn had said nothing. She had learned young that Southern women who spoke certain truths out loud found themselves labeled hysterical, confined to darkened rooms with laudanum and pitying whispers. So instead she watched, she listened. She paid attention to the things that happened in the spaces between words, in the silences that filled the house like water rising in a sinking ship. By March she knew the pattern. By April she knew the names. By May she had stopped sleeping in their shared bedroom, claiming the heat made her restless, taking instead a smaller room at the opposite end of the hall where she could lock the door and lie awake, counting the cracks in the ceiling. The realization, when it finally crystallized, didn't come with terrors. It came with something colder, something that felt like clarity after years of fog. She remembered standing in front of her mirror one morning, studying her own face as if seeing it for the first time, and thinking, "He has made me complicit. By being his wife, by living in this house, by taking meals from tables bought with this cruelty, I have become part of this. And then, quieter, more dangerous, but I don't have to stay complicit." You see, the idea began small, just a whisper in her own mind that she tried to dismiss. Ladies of her standing did not think such thoughts. Ladies of her standing accepted, endured, looked away with practiced grace. They took refuge in religion, or correspondence, or charitable works. and they certainly never ever considered turning their husband's sins back upon him. But Evelyn found she was tired of being a lady of her standing. She spent June gathering information with the same careful attention she once applied to needlework. She learned which of the field hands the colonel favored, always the young ones. Always the ones who had no choice, no voice, no power to refuse. She learned that the overseers knew and said nothing, that the house servants knew and could say nothing, that everyone on Everpine existed in a conspiracy of silence enforced by violence and fear. She also learned something else, something that would become the foundation of what she planned. She learned that power on a plantation was not really about ownership, whatever the law said. It was about performance, about the daily theater of dominance and submission, about who could command and who had to obey, about the carefully maintained illusion that this was natural, ordained, the way things simply were and always would be. And theater, she understood, could be right. By July, the plan had taken shape. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It would destroy her reputation, possibly her life, but it would also destroy him. And that had become the only thing that mattered. She had tried prayer. She had tried silence. She had tried being the perfect wife, the understanding spouse, the woman who looked away. Now she would try something else. She began with small changes. She stopped taking meals with the colonel, claiming headaches and vapors with the convenient vagueness that was expected of delicate ladies. She spent more time in the quarters, bringing medicine that actually worked, asking questions, learning names and stories and secrets. The enslaved people of Everpine watched her with suspicion at first. White women bearing gifts were rarely trustworthy, but slowly, carefully, she began to build something that might have been trust, or at least mutual understanding. There was one man in particular who caught her attention. His name was Isaiah, and he was 28 years old, born on Everpine to parents who had been sold away when he was 12. He worked the far fields, the ones closest to the swamp, where the mosquitoes bred thick, and the heat was worst. The colonel largely ignored him, too old to be interesting, too strong to be easy prey, and that made him perfect for what Evelyn needed. She approached him on a Tuesday evening as the work bell rang, and the field hands began the slow walk back to the quarters. The sun was setting behind the cypress trees, painting everything the color of old blood. Isaiah, her voice was quiet but clear. He stopped, his body going still in the way of someone who had learned that being noticed by white people was rarely good. "Yes, ma'am. I need to speak with you privately tonight after dark at the old stable behind the main house." His eyes flickered with something. Fear, confusion, maybe calculation. "Ma'am, I don't think. I'm not asking." She softened her tone, but only slightly. "I need your help with something that would hurt the colonel. Hurt him badly, but it would also put you in danger, which is why I'm asking rather than ordering. Come if you choose. Don't if you won't. But if you come ready to discuss something that cannot be undisclosed." She walked away before he could respond, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment. If he told the overseers, if he told anyone, her plan would collapse before it began. She would be confined, possibly sent away, definitely silenced. But if he came, if he understood what she was offering, what she was proposing. The night air brought no relief from the heat. Evelyn sat in the old stable, unused since they built the new one closer to the house, and waited in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Everpine at night, the distant singing from the quarters, the owls in the oaks, the whisper of the river somewhere beyond the fields, and then footsteps. Isaiah appeared in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by moonlight. He didn't enter immediately, just stood there watching her. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, controlled. "What do you want, Mrs. Carrington?" She stood, her hands clasped in front of her. "I want to destroy my husband completely, publicly, in a way he can never recover from." She paused. "And I need your help to do it." The silence stretched between them like the years of history, of violence, of power imbalances so vast they seemed insurmountable. Then Isaiah stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I'm listening." The candle between them flickered, casting shadows that danced across the stable walls like specters bearing witness to conspiracy. Evelyn had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times. But now, facing Isaiah in the humid darkness, the words felt heavier than she had anticipated. The colonel has been taking women from the quarters, she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Young women, girls really. He does this because he believes his position makes him untouchable, because he believes the law protects him, because he believes no one will ever challenge him. Isaiah's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. They both knew this already. Everyone on Everpine knew. I want to take that belief from him, Evelyn continued. I want him to understand what it feels like to have power stripped away, to be forced to witness something he cannot stop, cannot control, cannot escape from. She met his eyes directly. I want to humiliate him in front of the entire household in a way that will haunt him for the rest of his life. And how do you plan to do that? Evelyn took a breath. By becoming exactly what he fears most. By showing him that the power he thinks he has over this plantation, over the people here, over me, it's all an illusion. And I'm going to shatter that illusion in the most public, undeniable way possible. She explained her plan, speaking in low, measured tones. Isaiah listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable in the candlelight. When she finished, the silence that followed was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. You understand what you're asking, Isaiah finally said. It wasn't a question. I do. You understand what it would cost you. Your reputation, your standing, possibly your life. I understand. And you understand what it would cost me. What it would cost all of us if this goes wrong. Evelyn nodded slowly. I do. Which is why I'm asking, not commanding. You have every right to refuse. You have every right to walk out of here and forget this conversation ever happened. Isaiah studied her for a long moment. Why, he asked, why would you risk everything for this? You're white. You're wealthy. You could leave, go back to Charleston, get a divorce, start over somewhere else. Why this? Because leaving wouldn't change anything, Evelyn said quietly. He would still be here, still doing what he does, and I would spend the rest of my life knowing I did nothing but run away. She paused. And because I'm tired of being complicit, I'm tired of being the respectable wife who looks the other way. I'm tired of a system that protects monsters as long as they're wealthy monsters. So this is about justice. No, Evelyn said, justice would require a world that cares about justice. This is about revenge. Pure, calculated revenge, and I need you to help me deliver it. Isaiah was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, there's a woman in the quarters. Her name is Ruth. The colonel took her 3 months ago. She was 15. His voice was flat, controlled. She tried to resist. He had her whipped 20 lashes. Then he took her anyway. Evelyn felt something cold settle in her chest. I didn't know. You weren't supposed to know. That's how it works. Isaiah looked at her directly. If I help you with this, if we do what you're planning, it won't bring Ruth justice. It won't undo what happened to her or to any of the others. I know, but it might make him suffer. It might make him understand just for one night what it feels like to be powerless. Yes, Isaiah nodded slowly. Then I'll help you. Not because I trust you. I don't. But because I want to see that man broken. I want to see him realize that all his power, all his control, all his authority, it means nothing. That it never meant anything except what we allowed it to mean. Evelyn felt relief wash over her, followed immediately by fear. There are logistics we need to discuss. Timing, witnesses, how to ensure he can't simply have us both killed afterward. I've been thinking about that. Isaiah said, we need insurance. We need people outside this plantation who know what's happening and why. People who would ask questions if something happened to either of us. I have someone, Evelyn said, my sister in Charleston. She's married to a federal judge. I'll write her a letter explaining everything to be open only if I disappear or die under suspicious circumstances. Good. I'll make sure some of the men in the quarters know enough to tell the story if needed. Not the details, but enough to create questions. They spent the next hour planning in whispered detail. The date would be August 15th, 3 weeks away. That would give Evelyn time to make arrangements, to position people where she needed them, to ensure the stage was set perfectly. The location would be the great hall of the main house with every lamp lit, every window open, every servant positioned as witness. He'll try to stop it, Isaiah warned. The moment he realizes what's happening, he'll try to shut it down. I know, Evelyn said, which is why I'll have the doors locked and the keys hidden. Which is why I'll have invited guests, respectable neighbors who wouldn't dare leave in the middle of such a scene without causing scandal. Which is why I'll have prepared a speech that makes it clear if he tries to stop me by force, the entire county will know why. You've thought of everything. I've had months to think, months of lying awake, imagining his face when he realizes what I'm doing, imagining his shame, his humiliation, his complete and utter powerlessness. Evelyn's voice had gone cold. He's taken that feeling and inflicted it on dozens of people. Now he gets to experience it himself. As Isaiah prepared to leave, he turned back one more time. Mrs. Carrington, after this happens, assuming we both survive it, what then? What happens to you? Evelyn smiled, and there was something almost peaceful in it. Then I disappear. I've already made arrangements. A contact in New Orleans, passage on a ship to New York, enough money to start over. I'll be gone before dawn, and me, the others. I've written another letter, this one to be delivered to an abolitionist contact in Jackson. It contains evidence of the colonel's crimes, detailed accounts, dates, names, enough to destroy him socially, if not legally. Enough that he'll have to sell this place and leave Mississippi. You'll all be sold to different plantations probably, but at least you'll be away from him. Isaiah nodded slowly. It's not freedom. No, Evelyn agreed. It's not, but it's something. And right now something is all I can offer. After he left, Evelyn sat alone in the darkness for a long time, listening to the night sounds of Everpine. Somewhere in those sounds was the future. Uncertain, dangerous, possibly fatal. But for the first time in months, she felt something other than helpless rage. She felt purpose. The next 3 weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Evelyn maintained her routine of distance from the colonel, her careful performance of the vaporous, delicate wife who was to refine for the harsh realities of plantation life. She wrote her letters, sealed them, arranged for their delivery under specific circumstances. She made lists, checked details, rehearsed scenarios in her mind until she could recite them like prayers. She also watched the colonel more closely than ever before. She studied the way he moved through the world with such absolute confidence in his own supremacy. The way he gave orders expecting instant obedience. The way he touched things, furniture, horses, people with the casual ownership of someone who had never once questioned his right to everything within his reach. On August 10th, 5 days before her planned evening, something happened that almost derailed everything. The colonel came to her private room, something he hadn't done in months, and knocked softly on the door. Evelyn, may I speak with you? She considered not answering, but that would raise suspicions she couldn't afford. Come in, he entered, hat in hand, looking almost sheepish. For a moment, she saw the man she had married 3 years ago, before she knew what he was. Handsome in that weathered plantation way, with gray just beginning to show at his temples. I wanted to apologize, he said, for my distance lately, for neglecting you. I know I haven't been the husband you deserve. Evelyn felt her heart pounding, but kept her face neutral. What brought this on? I've been thinking about us, about our marriage, about how I want things to be better. He moved closer, and she could smell whiskey on his breath. I thought perhaps we could host a dinner party, invite the neighbors, show everyone that we're still the perfect couple they think we are. The irony was so sharp it almost made her laugh. Instead, she said, a dinner party. When? Soon, within the week, perhaps. What do you think? Evelyn's mind raced. This could actually work in her favor. I think that's a lovely idea. In fact, Why don't we make it August 15th? That gives me enough time to plan something truly memorable." His face lit up with relief. "Perfect. I'll leave all the arrangements to you. You always had such excellent taste." After he left, Evelyn sat down on her bed and laughed until tears ran down her face. He had just given her exactly what she needed, a legitimate reason to fill the house with witnesses, to have everyone present, to create a scene from which there could be no escape. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor, after all. She spent the next 5 days in a flurry of preparations. Invitations went out to the 6 neighboring plantation families, respectable people who would never dream of declining such an invitation. She ordered special foods from Natchez, arranged for extra servants, planned the evening down to the smallest detail. And through it all she met with Isaiah 3 more times in the old stable, refining their plan, preparing for every contingency they could imagine. On their final meeting 2 nights before the party, he asked her one last time if she was certain. "Once this starts," he said, "there's no stopping it, no taking it back." "Everything changes. Everything has already changed," Evelyn replied. This just makes it visible. On the evening of August 14th, Evelyn barely slept. She lay in her bed watching the ceiling, thinking about all the women who had suffered in this house, on this plantation. In this entire gala system, she thought about Ruth with her 15-year-old body and her 20 lashes. She thought about Mercy with her torn apron. She thought about all the names she knew and the countless ones she didn't. And she thought about the Colonel sleeping soundly in his bed, confident in his power, certain that tomorrow's dinner party would restore his image as the perfect Southern gentleman. He had no idea that tomorrow night his entire world would collapse around him. Dawn came soft and pink, filtering through the magnolia trees. Evelyn rose, dressed carefully in a gown of deep blue silk that she had ordered specifically for this occasion, not white. She was done pretending to be pure or innocent. Blue like deep water, like drowning, like the bruises she had seen on too many young women's arms. The day passed in a blur of final preparations. Guests began arriving at sunset. The Beaumonts from Riverside Plantation, the Chandlers from Oak Grove, the Waywrights, the Thorntons, the Prescotts, all dressed in their finest, all smiling their practiced Southern smiles, all utterly unprepared for what was about to unfold. Dinner was served at 7. Evelyn had never been more charming, more gracious, more perfectly the plantation mistress. She made witty conversation, laughed at the right moments, ensured everyone's glass was filled. The Colonel beamed with pride, clearly believing his plan to restore their image was working perfectly. At 9 o'clock, after the dessert had been cleared, and the guests had moved to the great hall for coffee and brandy, Evelyn stood and rang the small bell she had positioned on the mantelpiece. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "if I might have your attention for just a moment, I have a special entertainment planned for this evening, something truly unforgettable." The guests murmured with interest. The Colonel smiled indulgently, and Evelyn looked across the room to where Isaiah stood among the serving staff, their eyes meeting for just a moment. It was time. The great hall of Everpine had never looked more beautiful. Every lamp blazed with light, casting golden illumination across the French wallpaper and imported furniture. The windows stood open to catch any hint of breeze, but the August night offered none, only thick, pressing heat that made everyone's skin gleam with perspiration beneath their fine clothes. Evelyn's guests arranged themselves comfortably, the women settling onto the settees with their fans fluttering, the men standing near the brandy cart with crystal glasses in hand. They were all watching her with polite curiosity, expecting perhaps a piano recital or a poetry reading. The sorts of refined entertainments that characterized genteel Southern society. Colonel Carrington stood beside the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, looking every inch the prosperous plantation master. His smile was indulgent as he watched his wife, clearly pleased that she was finally behaving as he hoped, the perfect hostess, the ideal spouse. A credit to his name and position. He had no idea he was standing in the center of his own execution. "My dear friends," Evelyn began, her voice steady and clear. Before we proceed with tonight's entertainment, I must tell you a story. A true story about this house, this plantation, and the man standing before you." The Colonel's smile faltered slightly. Mrs. Beaumont's fan paused mid-flutter. The room's pleasant atmosphere shifted subtly, like the moment before a storm, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. "For 3 years," Evelyn continued, "I have been the wife of Colonel Carrington. I have managed his household, hosted his guests, and played the role expected of me. I have been silent when silence was demanded, blind when blindness was preferred, and deaf to the sounds of suffering that filled this plantation." "Evelyn," the Colonel's voice carried a warning tone. "What are you doing?" She ignored him, her gaze sweeping across the assembled guests. "But silence, I have discovered, is its own form of violence, and I am done being violent against myself and others through my complicity. Mrs. Carrington, perhaps you're not feeling well." This from Mr. Thornton, clearly uncomfortable, the heat can cause. "I am perfectly well," Evelyn said firmly, "perhaps more well than I have been in years. And what I'm about to tell you is this. My husband has spent the past 3 years systematically raping enslaved women on this plantation. Young women, girls. He has used his power to take what was never his to take, to violate those who could not refuse him, to inflict suffering for his own pleasure." The room erupted. Mrs. Chandler gasped audibly. The Colonel's face went from pink to red to nearly purple. Mr. Prescott set down his brandy glass with a sharp click. "That is a damned lie," the Colonel's voice boomed across the hall. "I will not stand here and be slandered in my own home by a hysterical." "Hysterical?" Evelyn's laugh was sharp and cold. "No, husband. Angry? Yes. Disgusted, certainly, but not hysterical. Hysteria would imply I'm not thinking clearly. I assure you, I have never thought more clearly in my life." She moved to the center of the room, commanding attention through sheer force of will. "I have names. I have dates. Ruth, age 15, violated in March and then whipped when she resisted. Mercy, 16, taken in February while performing her household duties. Carolyn, 17, Sarah, 14, Hannah, 16. Should I continue?" "You will stop this immediately." The Colonel started toward her, but Evelyn raised her hand. "Approach me, and every person in this room will witness you laying hands on your wife in anger. Is that really how you wish this evening to proceed?" He stopped, his fists clenched at his sides. Around them, the guests had gone silent, trapped between their desire to leave and their paralyzing need to avoid causing a scene. This was the calculation Evelyn had counted on, that Southern propriety would hold them in place long enough to see what came next. "You're all wondering," Evelyn said, addressing the guests directly, "why I would say such things publicly, why I would destroy my own reputation along with his. And the answer is simple, because his reputation needs destroying, because the silence around these crimes needs breaking. Because someone needs to stand in this room and name what has been happening in the darkness. If what you're saying is true," Mrs. Wainwright said carefully, clearly torn between scandal and sympathy, "then why handle it this way?" "Why not handle it how?" Evelyn interrupted. "Report it to the authorities, who don't consider it a crime. Seek help from a society that looks the other way as long as the victims are enslaved. Leave quietly and let him continue." She shook her head. "No, I want him to understand what he's done. I want him to feel what his victims have felt, and I want all of you to witness it." The Colonel had regained some composure, though his hands still trembled with rage. "You've lost your mind. Everything you're saying is." "I have evidence," Evelyn said quietly, "documentation, testimony from the victims themselves, written in my hand and signed with their marks. Copies of your plantation records showing patterns, letters you wrote that reference your activities. All of it has been copied and sent to contacts in Charleston, Jackson, and New Orleans. If anything happens to me tonight, that evidence becomes public." The threat landed like a stone in still water, ripples of implication spreading across the Colonel's face. He understood now that this wasn't a momentary outburst. This was planned, calculated, and potentially devastating. What do you want? His voice had gone hoarse. I want you to understand powerlessness, Evelyn said. I want you to experience what it feels like to watch something happen that you cannot stop, cannot control, cannot escape from. I want you to feel shame so profound that it changes the very structure of your soul. She turned to where Isaiah stood near the doorway. Their eyes met, and she gave him an almost imperceptible nod. He stepped forward into the light. The room's atmosphere shifted again, now crackling with tension so thick it seemed almost visible. The white guests stiffened, their ingrained prejudices and social roles warring with their fascination at whatever drama was unfolding. The other servants had gone utterly still, understanding that something unprecedented was happening, but not yet sure what it meant. This is Isaiah, Evelyn said. He has worked this plantation for 16 years. He has survived your cruelty, your system, your absolute belief in your own supremacy. She paused, letting the moment stretch. And tonight he and I are going to demonstrate exactly how fragile that supremacy really is. You can't be serious. The colonel's voice was barely above a whisper. You cannot possibly mean to. I mean to do exactly what you've done to countless women, Evelyn said. Except I'm going to do it with full consent from the only person whose consent matters, mine, and I'm going to make you watch every moment of it. The colonel lunged forward then, propriety forgotten, but Mr. Beaumont and Mr. Chandler caught him, holding him back more from shock than any real agreement with what was happening. The women were beyond gasping now. Mrs. Prescott looked like she might faint, while Mrs. Thornton's face showed something that might have been horrified fascination. If any of you wish to leave, Evelyn said, addressing the guests, the doors are there, but know that if you leave now, you'll spend the rest of your lives wondering what happened next, wondering if I really meant it, and you'll hear the stories anyway, garbled, exaggerated, turned into myths and legends. Better to stay and witness the truth. No one moved, whether from shock, curiosity, or the same social paralysis that had held them this long. They remained in place. Evelyn turned back to her husband. You made those women powerless. You took their choice, their dignity, their autonomy. Now you're going to watch as I exercise my choice, my power, my autonomy in a way that destroys everything you believe about your own supremacy. Please, the word came out broken. The colonel's face had gone from purple to ashen. Please don't do this. Did Ruth say please? Evelyn asked quietly. Did Mercy? Did any of them? And did you stop? She moved toward Isaiah, who stood with perfect stillness, his face unreadable, but his eyes meeting hers with something that might have been respect or might have been shared rage or might have been both. Mr. Isaiah, she said formally, I need you to understand something before we proceed. What I'm about to do is my choice, and mine alone. If you don't wish to be part of this, you can walk out that door right now, and I'll find another way to make my point. He studied her for a long moment, then, in a voice that carried clearly through the hall, I understand, Mrs. Carrington, and I choose to help you. The words hung in the air, transforming everything. This wasn't just a white woman's revenge anymore. This was something more complex, more dangerous. A moment where the carefully constructed boundaries of their society were being deliberately publicly demolished. Evelyn began unbuttoning the high collar of her blue silk dress, her fingers steady despite the hammering of her heart. The colonel made an anguished sound, but the men holding him tightened their grip. The women in the room had their fans frozen in midair, their faces showing expressions ranging from horror to fascination to something that might have been vicarious satisfaction. Stop, the colonel begged. Please, Evelyn, I'll do anything. I'll free them all. I'll sell the plantation. I'll leave Mississippi. Just stop this. Evelyn paused, her hands stilling on the buttons. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then she spoke, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to age her decades in a single moment. You would promise me anything right now to avoid this humiliation, just as they would have promised you anything to avoid theirs. But you didn't stop. You didn't listen to their pleases. You didn't care about their dignity, or their pain, or their humanity, she resumed, unbuttoning. Now you get to understand how that feels. This is madness, Mr. Wainwright said, though he made no move to leave. Mrs. Carrington, think about what you're doing. Think about the scandal. Think about. I have thought about it, Evelyn said, for months. Every detail, every consequence, and I've decided that some things are worth the cost. Some truths need to be spoken even when they destroy the speaker. Some acts of defiance are necessary, even when they're social suicide. She let the top of her dress fall open, revealing the white chemise beneath. The room had gone so quiet that the sound of fabric rustling seemed loud as thunder. Outside, through the open windows, the night sounds of Everpine continued. Crickets and frogs and the distant rush of the river, oblivious to the revolution happening within these walls. Isaiah remained perfectly still, waiting for her signal, understanding that despite everything, despite the power dynamics at play, despite the horrible systems that had brought them to this moment, right now in this room, she was the one in control. She was the one making choices, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. The lamplight caught the tears streaming down the colonel's face, and Evelyn felt something she hadn't expected, not triumph, but a strange hollow satisfaction. This was what breaking looked like. This was what it meant to have someone's entire self-concept shattered in front of witnesses who could never unknow what they'd seen. I want you to remember this feeling, Evelyn said softly, though her voice carried to every corner of the hall. The helplessness, the shame, the knowledge that people you consider your equals are watching your humiliation, and there's nothing, absolutely nothing, you can do to stop it. She turned to Isaiah, who had remained utterly composed throughout. In his stillness, she recognized a different kind of strength than she'd ever understood before, the strength of people who had survived by learning to become unreadable, to hide their true thoughts behind masks of compliance. But tonight there would be no masks. I need you to understand something else, she said to him loud enough for everyone to hear. This isn't about desire. This isn't about any genuine connection between us. This is about power. About demonstrating that the hierarchies we've all accepted as natural and unchangeable are actually nothing but collective delusions enforced by violence. Isaiah nodded slowly. I understand, Mrs. Carrington. Do you? She held his gaze. Because what I'm asking you to do could get you killed. Not tonight, perhaps. Not with all these witnesses, but later, somewhere down the line. The colonel might not be able to touch you here and now, but this is Mississippi in 1847. A black man who participates in humiliating a white man, even with his wife's full consent. She stopped, choosing her words carefully. It's dangerous, more dangerous for you than for me. Everything is dangerous for me, Isaiah said quietly. Every day I wake up on this plantation is dangerous. At least tonight the danger means something. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. Recognition perhaps of the vast difference between her choice to be here and his. She was choosing scandal and exile. He was choosing potential death. And yet he stood there steady and sure, because sometimes the chance to defy the system was worth any cost. Then we proceed, she said. But before she could move, a new voice cut through the tension. Wait. Everyone turned to see Sarah, the house servant who had worked at Everpine for 12 years, stepping forward from where she'd been standing with the other staff. Her face was set in lines of determination that seemed carved from stone. Mrs. Carrington, before you do this, there's something everyone in this room needs to hear. Sarah's voice trembled slightly, but grew stronger as she continued. You all want to know if what she's saying about the colonel is true. Well, I can tell you it is. I've been in this house long enough to see it all. I've cleaned up after it. I've held the girls while they cried. I've tended wounds that should never have existed. Sarah, that's enough. The colonel started, but she cut him off. No, sir, it ain't near enough. You had your say for 12 years. Now I'll have mine. She looked around at the white faces staring at her with shock. Ruth wasn't the first, and she wouldn't have been the last. There was Celia before her, and Martha before that, and Grace before that. Some of them were sold away after, sent down river so their stories couldn't come back to haunt you. Some of them are still here, still working your fields, still having to see your face every day and pretend like nothing happened. Mrs. Beaumont had gone pale. Mr. Chandler looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, but they stayed, transfixed by the testimony unfolding before them. And you all knew, Sarah continued, now addressing the white guest directly. Maybe not the details, but you knew something. You all know how the system works. You all benefit from it. So don't stand there acting shocked like this is some surprise. The only surprise is that someone's finally saying it out loud. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Mrs. Thornton spoke, her voice small and uncertain. We didn't know the extent of it. You didn't want to know. Sarah said, there's a difference. Evelyn felt a surge of unexpected emotion. She had planned to carry this confrontation alone, to be the sole voice speaking truth to power. But Sarah's testimony added something she couldn't have provided. The voice of the actual victims, the people who had lived through the Colonel's cruelty firsthand. Thank you, Sarah, Evelyn said quietly. Sarah nodded and stepped back, but her presence had fundamentally changed the dynamic in the room. This was no longer just about a wife's revenge on her husband. This was about a system being named, examined, and condemned by those who suffered under it. The Colonel had collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands. The fight seemed to have gone out of him, replaced by something that looked almost like despair. But Evelyn had seen him manipulate and perform before. She didn't trust this apparent surrender. Are you going to continue, Mrs. Prescott asked, her voice barely above a whisper. With your plan. Evelyn looked at Isaiah, then back at the assembled guests. That depends. Has the point been made? Do you all understand now what has been happening here? Do you see how power works? How it corrupts? How it turns human beings into monsters and victims into invisible ghosts? We see, Mr. Beaumont said heavily. He released his hold on the Colonel and stepped back. God help us, we see. Then perhaps, Evelyn said slowly, the demonstration isn't necessary. Perhaps the threat was enough. Perhaps the Colonel's complete and utter humiliation in front of his peers is sufficient punishment for tonight. She moved to stand directly in front of her husband, who finally looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. You will sell this plantation, she said, her voice hard as iron. You will free every enslaved person here properly, legally, with papers that give them the best chance of staying free. You will leave Mississippi and never return. And you will live with the knowledge that everyone in this room tonight knows exactly what you are. And if I refuse, then I finish what I started right here, right now, with even less mercy than I've shown so far. Evelyn leaned closer, and I promise you, the reality will be far worse than your imagination. Because I've had months to plan this, and what you've seen so far is only the beginning of what I'm capable of. The Colonel's face crumpled. I'll do it. Whatever you want. Just end this, please. Evelyn straightened, feeling the weight of the moment settling around her like a cloak. She had won, not in the way she'd originally planned perhaps, but in the way that mattered most. She had broken his power, exposed his crimes, and ensured that his life would never be the same. But she also felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, but exhaustion. The rage that had sustained her for months was draining away, leaving behind a hollow awareness of how much this had cost everyone involved. She turned to the guests. You're all witnesses to his promise. If he fails to honor it, you'll all know why, and you'll all bear responsibility for what happens next. One by one, they nod. They were complicit now, bound by knowledge they couldn't unknow. Whatever comfortable lies they told themselves about the genteel nature of plantation life had been stripped away, leaving them exposed to truths they'd spent years avoiding. This evening is concluded, Evelyn said. I suggest you all return to your homes and think carefully about what you've witnessed, about what you've allowed through your silence, about what kind of society you want to live in. The guests filed out in near silence, their fine clothes rustling, their faces stunned. Within minutes, the great hall had emptied, except for Evelyn, Isaiah, Sarah, and the colonel, who remained slumped in his chair. What happens now? Isaiah asked quietly. Now, Evelyn said, we finish this properly. Colonel, you will go to your study and begin drafting the papers. I want every enslaved person on this plantation freed by tomorrow evening. I want bills of sale prepared for the property. I want everything documented and witnessed. Where will you go? He asked without looking up. That's no longer your concern. She turned to Isaiah and Sarah. I have money set aside, enough to help people get north, to pay for passage and supplies. It's not much, but it's something. Anyone who wants to leave Everpine can leave with resources to start over. You planned for this. Sarah said wonderingly, all of it. I planned for several possible outcomes, Evelyn admitted. This wasn't the one I expected, but it might be the best one. No one had to complete the act. The point was made anyway. Isaiah looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You were really going to do it, though, weren't you? Yes, Evelyn said simply. I was ready to sacrifice everything, my reputation, my safety, my entire future to break him, because some things are worth any cost. That's courage or madness, Sarah said. Maybe both. Probably both, Evelyn agreed with a tired smile. Over the next few hours, the machinery of destruction and liberation ground forward. The colonel, under close supervision, drafted the necessary papers. Lawyers were summoned from Natchez despite the late hour. Witnesses were assembled, and by dawn, the legal framework was in place. Everpine Plantation would be sold. Its enslaved population would be free with papers, with documentation, with as much legal protection as existed for free black people in Mississippi in 1847, which was not much, but was better than nothing. Evelyn spent those hours moving through the quarters, speaking with people, offering what resources she could. Some took her money and left immediately, heading north with hope and terror in their eyes. Others stayed, at least temporarily, uncertain what freedom meant or where to go. A few looked at her with undisguised suspicion, and she didn't blame them. She was still a white woman who had benefited from their suffering, regardless of what she'd done tonight. But Ruth, the 15-year-old girl who had been violated and whipped, found Evelyn as the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, Mrs. Carrington. Evelyn turned. The girl looked small in the growing light, but there was something unbroken in her eyes. Yes, Ruth, I wanted to say, thank you ain't the right word. What you did tonight, it won't undo what happened to me. It won't give me back what he took. I know, Evelyn said softly, but it means something that someone saw, someone witnessed. Someone said it out loud where people had to hear it. Ruth paused. My whole life, people who looked like you told me I wasn't fully human, that I didn't matter, that what happened to me was just the way things were. Tonight, you told them different. That matters. Even if it doesn't change everything, it matters. Evelyn felt tears burning her eyes. I wish I'd done it sooner. So do I, Ruth said honestly, but you did it. That's more than most people do. They stood together in silence as the sun rose over Everpine, painting the cotton fields in shades of gold and amber. It was beautiful and terrible all at once. This land built on suffering, this wealth extracted from stolen lives. This entire edifice of Southern gentility that was really just violence wearing fancy clothes. What will you do now? Ruth asked. Leave, Evelyn said. Disappear. Start over somewhere no one knows my name or my story. Try to build something that isn't built on other people's pain. That's most places, though, Ruth said quietly. Pain is everywhere. It's what you do about it that matters. Evelyn nodded, understanding the truth in those words. She had done something. Whether it was enough, whether it mattered in the grand scheme of things, whether it changed anything beyond this one plantation. Those were questions without clear answers, but she had stopped being complicit. She had used what power she had to break the power of someone who had used his position to cause immeasurable harm. It was a beginning, not an ending. But sometimes a beginning was all you could hope for. By mid-morning, word of what had happened at Everpine had spread through Natchez like fever through a crowded hospital. Servants talked, guests whispered. The lawyers who had been summoned in the dead of night carried the story with them like a disease, infecting every drawing room and gentleman's club within 10 miles. Evelyn stood in her stripped bedroom, most of her belongings already packed and loaded onto a wagon bound for the river, and watched through the window as carriages began arriving at the plantation, not social calls. These were men, important men, coming to assess the damage and determine what needed to be done to contain this scandal. She recognized Mayor Hutcherson's carriage, Judge Weaver's, and several others belonging to the wealthiest planters in the county. They would be furious, she knew, not about the colonel's crimes. Those were unfortunate, but ultimately acceptable within their worldview. They would be furious that she had exposed those crimes publicly, that she had threatened the social order they all depended on, that she had dared to name what was supposed to remain unspoken. "They're coming for you," Sarah said from the doorway. "You know that." "Right. I know." "They'll try to have you declared insane, committed to an asylum. It's what they do to women who speak inconvenient truths." Evelyn turned to face her. "That's why I'm leaving before they can act. The wagon leaves for Natchez in an hour. I'll be on a river boat by sunset. By the time they get court orders or medical evaluations, I'll be in New Orleans. From there a ship to New York, and if they catch you before then I have letters already sent to 3 different newspapers in 3 different cities detailing everything that happened here. Letters that will be published if I disappear or if anything happens to me." Evelyn smiled grimly. "I may have started this as revenge, but I finished it with insurance." Sarah nodded slowly. "You thought of everything." "I tried too, though I'm sure there are holes in my plans large enough to drive a carriage through." Evelyn moved away from the window. "How are people in the quarters? Are they leaving?" "Some already gone. Others packing, a few too scared to leave. Better the devil you know than the road north." Sarah's expression was complicated. "And some talking about what to do if the colonel tries to back out of his promises once you're gone." "He won't," Evelyn said with certainty. "Too many witnesses, too many documents, too much risk of exposure. He'll honor the letter of his agreement because the alternative is worse." "The letter maybe, but the spirit." Sarah shook her head. "Men like him always find ways around their promises, which is why I've arranged for follow-up. A contact in Jackson will be checking in monthly to verify that the terms are being met. If they're not, more letters get published, more questions get asked, more scandal erupts. You've made yourself into a permanent threat to him." "Good." Evelyn said he should spend the rest of his life knowing that someone is watching, someone is waiting for him to slip. Someone is ready to destroy it. What's left of his reputation if he tries to return to his old ways? A knock at the door interrupted them. Isaiah stood there dressed in clothes that weren't slave clothing anymore. Real trousers, a proper shirt, a hat in his hands. He looked both more and less comfortable in them, as if freedom came with its own weight. "The men are here," he said. "The important ones. They're demanding to see you. Tell them I'll be down shortly. They're also demanding to see the colonel, but he's locked himself in his study and won't come out." Evelyn felt a flicker of satisfaction. Let him hide. Let him cower in his room while she faced the consequences of exposing him. It was a fitting image, the coward behind closed doors while the woman he tried to control stood her ground. "I'll handle them," she said. "You sure about that?" Isaiah's expression was skeptical. "These men, they're not going to be reasonable. They're going to try to intimidate you, threaten you, maybe worse. Let them try." She made her way downstairs, Sarah and Isaiah following at a respectful distance. The great hall, where she'd staged her confrontation the night before, had been hastily straightened. Furniture returned to its proper places, lamps extinguished, evidence of the previous evening's drama carefully erased. But the memory of what had happened here hung in the air like smoke that couldn't be cleared away. The men were waiting in the drawing room, 6 of them, all past 50, all wealthy beyond measure, all wearing expressions that ranged from fury to cold calculation. Mayor Hutcherson stood at their center, his considerable bulk draped in expensive fabric, his face tight with anger, Mrs. Carrington. His voice was ice-wrapped in southern courtesy. I believe we need to have a conversation about your behavior last evening. Good morning, gentlemen, Evelyn said, her tone matching his for pleasantness. I'm afraid I don't have much time. My travel arrangements require me to depart within the hour. You're not going anywhere, Judge Weaver said flatly. Not until we've sorted out this mess you've created. What mess would that be? The mess of my husband serially raping enslaved women, or the mess of me exposing that fact publicly? The bluntness of her words made several of them flinch. But Mayor Hutcherson recovered quickly. Mrs. Carrington, you're clearly unwell. The strain of plantation life, the heat, perhaps some feminine hysteria. I'm going to stop you right there, Evelyn interrupted. I am not hysterical. I am not unwell. I am not suffering from vapors or nerves or any other condition you want to diagnose to avoid confronting what I've exposed. I am perfectly sane, perfectly rational, and perfectly aware of what I've done and why. Then you're aware you've committed slander, one of the other men said. You've damaged the colonel's reputation without proof. I have proof. Documentation, testimony, medical evidence in some cases. All of it copied and sent to multiple locations where it will be published if anything happens to me or if the colonel fails to honor his commitments. The men exchanged glances. This was worse than they thought. A hysterical woman could be controlled, committed, medicated, silenced. But a calculating woman with evidence and a plan, that was far more dangerous. What do you want? Judge Weaver asked bluntly. I want nothing from you, Evelyn said. My business is with my husband, and that business is concluded. I'm leaving Natchez today and never returning. You'll never see me again, never hear from me again, unless the colonel violates our agreement, in which case you'll all hear far more from me than you ever wanted. And what about the damage you've done to our community? Mayor Hutcherson's voice had risen. The scandal you've created, the questions you've raised about institutions that have existed here for generations. You mean slavery, Evelyn said calmly. Yes, I have raised questions about that. Perhaps you should be asking those questions yourselves instead of trying to silence me for asking them. You've gone too far, Judge Weaver said. You've crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. You've made accusations that shouldn't be made, and you've involved yourself in matters that are none of your concern. My husband's crimes are very much my concern, Evelyn said, as is my own complicity in those crimes. Through my silence, I was complicit. I chose to break that silence. That was my right. No woman has the right to humiliate her husband publicly, one of the other men said, to violate the sanctity of marriage. The sanctity of marriage, Evelyn's laugh was bitter. He violated that sanctity every time he forced himself on an enslaved woman. Every time he used his position to take what was never his to take. But I suppose that kind of violation doesn't count in your reckoning. This is getting us nowhere, Mayor Hutcherson said. He turned to the others. Perhaps we should speak with the colonel directly, get his version of events. Feel free, Evelyn said, though I doubt he'll open his door. He's discovered that shame is harder to bear when it's public knowledge. She turned to leave, but Judge Weaver's voice stopped her. Mrs. Carrington, I want to be clear about something. If you leave here today, if you spread these stories beyond our community, there will be consequences. We have connections, influence. We can make your life very difficult wherever you go. Evelyn turned back, and for the first time since entering the room, she let her true anger show. Threaten me all you want, Judge. I've already sacrificed everything that matters to me in Southern society. My reputation, my social standing, my marriage, my home. I have nothing left for you to take. But you have everything to lose. Your comfortable lies, your willful blindness, your carefully maintained ignorance about the suffering that props up your wealth and power. Those things are all more fragile than you realize, and I've just demonstrated exactly how easily they can be shattered. She walked to the door, then paused. One more thing, gentlemen. I know you'll close ranks after I'm gone. You'll declare me insane, or morally corrupt, or whatever label you need to dismiss what I've said. You'll protect the colonel as much as you can because protecting him protects the system you all depend on. But you'll never be able to completely erase what happened last night. Every one of you will remember. And in the quiet moments when you're alone with your thoughts, you'll have to confront what that remembering means. She left them standing in stand silence, Sarah and Isaiah following her out into the morning light. That was something, Sarah said once they were outside. That was necessary, Evelyn corrected. They needed to understand that I'm not backing down, not recanting, not apologizing. Whatever happens next, they'll know I meant every word. The wagon was ready, her trunks loaded, the driver waiting patiently. Evelyn took one last look at Everpine, the white columns, the manicured grounds, the field stretching toward the horizon. It had been beautiful once before she knew what that beauty cost. Now it just looked like what it was, a monument to cruelty wrapped in elegant architecture. Mrs. Carrington. Isaiah approached hesitantly. I wanted to thank you for what you did, for what you risked. Don't thank me yet, Evelyn said. We won't know if any of this actually mattered until we see what happens next. If the colonel honors his promises, if the freed people make it safely north, if the system actually changes or just adapts to protect itself better. But you tried, Isaiah said. That's more than most people do. More than most people ever will do. Evelyn felt tears pricking her eyes, but refused to let them fall. It should have been more. It should have been sooner. It should have been. It was what it was, Isaiah interrupted gently. And that something, maybe not everything, but something, they stood in silence for a moment. To people from completely different worlds who had briefly aligned against a common enemy. Then Isaiah extended his hand, a gesture of equality that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours ago. Evelyn took it, shaking firmly. Where will you go? She asked. North, eventually. First, I am going to make sure the others get away safely. Make sure the colonel actually processes the papers. Make sure this doesn't all fall apart the moment you're gone. That's dangerous. Everything's dangerous, Isaiah said again. At least this way, the danger means something. Evelyn climbed into the wagon, settling herself among her trunks and cases. As the driver urged the horses forward, she looked back one final time at Everpine, at the people gathered to watch her leave, at the life she was abandoning. She felt no regret, only a strange sense of completion, as if a chapter that should have ended long ago was finally properly closed. The wagon rolled down the long driveway through the gates of Everpine and out onto the road toward Natchez. Behind her, the plantation receded into the distance. Ahead, the future stretched uncertain and unknowable, but for the first time in 3 years, Evelyn Carrington felt free. The riverboat Mississippi Queen left Natchez at sunset, its paddle wheel churning the brown water into foam as it headed south toward New Orleans. Evelyn stood at the stern rail, watching the city recede into the gathering dusk, its lights beginning to flicker on like earthbound stars. She had purchased passage under a false name, Mrs. Elizabeth Cartwright of Mobile, traveling to visit family. The deception had been easy. No one looked too closely at a well-dressed white woman traveling alone as long as she had money and maintained proper decorum. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same social privileges that had enabled her husband's crimes now facilitated her escape. Her cabin was small, but comfortable, and after the emotional exhaustion of the past 24 hours, Evelyn found herself grateful for the solitude. She locked the door, removed her traveling clothes, and sat in her chemise at the small writing desk, staring at blank paper. She should write to her sister in Charleston. She should begin the process of rebuilding whatever life awaited her in New York. She should plan, prepare, think about practical matters like money and lodging and how to survive as a woman alone with no husband, no family support, and a reputation that would follow her like a shadow if anyone discovered who she really was. Instead, she found herself writing a different kind of letter, not to send to anyone, but to preserve a record of what had happened and why. In her own words, unfiltered by scandal or myth, "My name is Evelyn Carrington," she wrote, "and I want the truth to be known, even if it never becomes public. I want someone someday to understand that what I did was not madness or revenge alone, but a desperate attempt to break a cycle of violence that was crushing everyone it touched." She wrote for hours, filling page after page with details the newspapers would never print. The names of the victims, the dates of the colonel's assaults, the way the system protected him at every turn, the complicity of silence, of looking away, of accepting cruelty as long as it stayed hidden. She also wrote about her own culpability, the months she had suspected but said nothing, the way her privileged position had blinded her to realities that should have been obvious, the fact that her dramatic confrontation, while satisfying, had done little to actually dismantle the structures that enabled such abuse in the first place. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote. "I don't deserve it. I lived in luxury built on suffering, and I was slow to act even when I knew the truth. My gesture, grand as it seemed in that moment, was ultimately more about my own conscience than genuine justice. True justice would require tearing down the entire system. I merely embarrassed one man within it." A knock at her cabin door interrupted her writing. Evelyn froze, her heart suddenly racing. Had they sent men after her? Had the judge made good on his threats? "Who is it?" She called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Delivery for Mrs. Cartwright." Cautiously, she opened the door to find a young porter holding a sealed envelope. "This was left at the dock for you, Mum." The man said it was urgent. Evelyn took the envelope with trembling fingers, tipped the porter, and closed the door. The envelope was unmarked except for her false name. She broke the seal with the letter opener from the writing desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper in unfamiliar handwriting. "Mrs. Carrington, you don't know me, but I was one of the servants at the Beaumont Plantation. I was serving at your dinner party last night. I heard everything. I wanted you to know that what you did matters, not just because of what happened to the colonel, but because of what it did to everyone who witnessed it. You made people see what they'd been trying not to see. You made people hear what they'd been trying not to hear. My sister was one of the girls on your plantation, Sarah's niece. She's going north now with papers and money. She has a chance because of what you did. That doesn't fix everything. It doesn't change the whole world, but it changed her world, and that matters. Go safely, live free, and know that you did more than you think." Evelyn read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She had prepared herself for condemnation, for scandal, for being reviled as a mad woman who had destroyed her own life for nothing. She hadn't prepared for gratitude, for recognition that her actions, flawed and incomplete as they were, had meant something to someone. She folded the letter carefully and placed it between the pages of her own account, 2 different testimonies that together told a more complete truth than either could alone. Over the next 3 days, as the Mississippi Queen made its way south, Evelyn kept mostly to her cabin. She took meals in her room, avoided the social areas of the boat, and spent her time writing, thinking, trying to process everything that had happened. On the second night, she had a nightmare. She dreamed she was back at Everpine, but this time she was the one in the fields working under the burning sun while the colonel watched from the shade of the great house. In the dream she tried to run, but her feet were stuck in the red clay. She tried to scream, but no sound emerged. She woke gasping, her chemise soaked with sweat, her heart pounding. The nightmare made her confront something she'd been avoiding, guilt, not for what she'd done to the colonel, but for what she hadn't done sooner, for the women who had suffered while she was still gathering her courage, for the system she had benefited from, even as she prepared to rebel against it. She understood, with painful clarity, that her dramatic gesture had been cathartic for her, but had done little to actually help the people who needed help most. Yes, the enslaved people on Everpine were being freed. Yes, the colonel had been humiliated, but those were small victories in a much larger war. The system itself remained intact. Other plantations continued operating. Other men continued doing what the colonel had done, secure in the knowledge that society would protect them. Her revolution had been personal, not systemic. and that limitation felt like a failure. On the third morning, she woke to find the Mississippi Queen approaching New Orleans. The city sprawled along the river, larger and more chaotic than Natchez, a place where people could disappear into crowds and reinvent themselves without anyone asking too many questions. As the boat docked, Evelyn gathered her things and prepared to disembark into her new life. She had contacts in the city, abolitionist sympathizers who would help her arrange passage to New York. She had money carefully hoarded and converted into forms that couldn't be traced back to the colonel. She had a plan, rough as it was. What she didn't have was certainty about whether what she'd done would have any lasting impact, about whether the freed people from Everpine would actually make it to safety, about whether the colonel would honor his promises or find ways to circumvent them once the immediate scrutiny faded. All she had was the knowledge that she had acted according to her conscience regardless of the cost. That would have to be enough. New Orleans was overwhelming after the relative quiet of plantation life. The streets teemed with people of every description, sailors and merchants, enslaved people and free people of color, immigrants speaking a dozen different languages. The air smelled of coffee and river mud and spices Evelyn couldn't name. She found lodging at a modest boarding house run by a French woman who asked no questions as long as the rent was paid on time. Her room was on the third floor, small and spare, but clean with a window overlooking the street below. That night, Evelyn wrote one final entry in her account. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if what I did will matter in the long run. I don't know if I'll be remembered as a hero or a mad woman or simply forgotten entirely. But I know this. I stopped being complicit. I used what power I had to challenge someone who had far more power than I did. I spoke truth in a place where truth was dangerous, and I survived to tell this story. That's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's something, and sometimes, in a world this broken, something is all we can do. She sealed the account in an envelope and addressed it to her sister in Charleston with instructions to open it only in the event of Evelyn's death. Then she hid it among her other papers and prepared for bed. Sleep came easier that night, not because her conscience was clear. It wasn't and probably never would be, but because she had finally stopped lying to herself about what she was, what she'd been part of, and what she tried, however imperfectly, to resist. The weeks that followed took on a strange rhythm. Evelyn spent her days making arrangements for passage to New York, meeting with abolitionist contacts, and trying to piece together news from Mississippi. Reports filtered south slowly. The colonel had indeed sold Everpine, though for far less than its value. The free people were scattering, some going north, others disappearing into the complexities of free black life in the South, where freedom was always conditional and never truly safe. One piece of news hit her particularly hard. Ruth, the 15-year-old girl who had been so brutally victimized, had made it to Memphis and from there to Cincinnati. She was living with a Quaker family who had taken her in, learning to read, beginning the long process of healing. That single piece of information did more to justify Evelyn's actions than anything else could have. One life changed, one girl given a chance. It wasn't enough, would never be enough, but it was real. In early October, Evelyn finally boarded a ship bound for New York. As the vessel pulled away from the dock, she stood on deck, watching New Orleans recede into the distance and beyond it, the entire South with its contradictions and cruelties and buried truths. She was 32 years old, carrying nothing but a few trunks of belongings and a story that would follow her like a ghost. She had no family support, no social connections in New York, no clear plan for how to build a life there, but she was free. Free from the colonel, free from the plantation, free from the suffocating weight of being complicit in a system she despised. That freedom came at a terrible cost. Her reputation was destroyed. Her marriage was ended. Her place in Southern society was obliterated, and she carried the burden of knowing that her dramatic gesture, while personally satisfying, had done little to change the fundamental injustices that had provoked it. Still, as the ship sailed north along the Atlantic coast, Evelyn felt something she hadn't experienced in years, Hope. Not naive hope that the world would suddenly become just, but hope that it was possible to resist, to fight back, to refuse to accept cruelty as inevitable. She thought about the letter from the anonymous servant. You did more than you think. Maybe that was true. Maybe small acts of resistance, even incomplete ones, even selfish ones, still matter. Maybe the sum total of individual conscience, however flawed, could eventually shift the balance towards something better. Or maybe she was fooling herself, constructing comfortable narratives to justify actions that had been more about her own rage than any genuine commitment to justice. She didn't know. She would probably never know for certain, but she had acted. That was something. In a world where most people chose silence, she had chosen to speak. In a society that demanded complicity, she had chosen rebellion. The gesture was imperfect, incomplete, and probably insufficient, but it was hers. And now, sailing toward an uncertain future in a city she'd never seen, Evelyn Carrington, who would soon become Elizabeth Cartwright, and later perhaps someone else entirely, carried that gesture with her, not as a source of pride exactly, but as a reminder of what was possible when someone finally refused to accept the unacceptable. The South would remember her, though not kindly. They would call her mad, immoral, a cautionary tale of what happened when women overstepped their bounds. They would use her story to reinforce the very systems she had tried to challenge, pointing to her as evidence that questioning the social order led only to ruin. But others would remember her, too. The women who had survived the colonel's abuse. The people who had witnessed her confrontation and been forced to acknowledge truths they preferred to ignore. The ones who would carry her story forward, perhaps transforming it into something larger than the events themselves. Years later, when the war came, and the South burned, and the system of slavery finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, people would sometimes speak of Evelyn Carrington. They would get the details wrong, exaggerate some parts, forget others. But they would remember the essential truth that on one hot August night in 1847 in the great hall of Everpine Plantation, a woman had stood before her husband and destroyed him with nothing but words and witnesses. Some called it revenge, others called it justice, still others called it madness. Evelyn herself, in the years that followed, would come to think of it simply as necessary, one moment of refusal in a lifetime of compliance. One crack in a wall that would eventually crumble, though not in her lifetime, and not because of her actions alone, but cracks matter. Each one weakened the structure a little more. Each one made the next crack easier. And someday perhaps the accumulated weight of all those individual acts of resistance would bring the whole rotten edifice down. That was her hope anyway, and hope, however fragile, was enough to keep sailing toward tomorrow. The ship cut through the dark water, carrying her away from everything she'd known toward everything she might become. Behind her, the South receded into memory and legend. Ahead, the future waited, unknowable and full of possibility. Evelyn stood at the rail until long after the coastline had disappeared from view, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, and thinking about all the women who would come after her. The ones who would have to make their own choices about complicity and resistance, silence and speech, acceptance and rebellion. She hoped they would choose resistance. She hoped they would find the courage she had struggled so long to find. She hoped they would do better than she had done, go further than she had gone, fight harder and more effectively and with greater wisdom. But even if they didn't, even if they'd have fell short of the justice they sought, at least they would have tried. And in trying, they would prove that the system could be challenged, that the powerful could be confronted, that the apparently inevitable was actually contingent and therefore changeable. That was the real legacy of that night at Everpine. Not the colonel's humiliation, or Evelyn's exile, or even the freedom of one plantation's enslaved people. The real legacy was the proof that resistance was possible. And once people knew that resistance was possible, everything else became possible, too. Evelyn smiled into the darkness, pulled her shawl tighter against the sea breeze, and turned to face north toward New York, toward the rest of her life, toward whatever came next. The past was done. The future was waiting, and for the first time in 3 years, she was ready to meet it on her own terms. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human drama, as the ship carried her into tomorrow. Behind her, Everpine Plantation stood empty in the Mississippi darkness, its white columns gleaming under the moon. A monument to a woman who had refused to be silent, and a system that would never be quite the same because of her refusal. They said she was mad. They said she was dangerous. They said she had destroyed herself for nothing. But in the quarters and kitchens and quiet places where the powerless gathered to share stories, they said something different. They said she had been justice in human form. They said she had spoken for those who couldn't speak. They said she had shown that even the mighty could fall if someone was brave enough to push. And in the end, those were the stories that mattered. Those were the stories that would survive long after the scandalized whispers of high society had faded into silence. The revenge of Evelyn Carrington became legend, not because of what she did exactly, but because of what it represented. The moment when someone looked at injustice and said, "Enough." The moment when compliance ended and resistance began. The moment when the carefully constructed lies of an entire society met the raw truth of one woman's rage and shattered like glass. It wasn't a revolution. It was barely even a gesture, but it was real, and it happened, and nothing was ever quite the same afterward. And sometimes that's all any of us can hope to leave behind.